Thanks, Professor Stephan. Thanks to the ANU for having me back, and thanks for everyone for coming along this evening. In discussing Quarry Vision this evening, I'm going to try out a new, very clean technology. It's not quite ready for commercial deployment, on a meaningful scale at least, but it's alluring to think that it might be just around the corner. And no, I'm not talking about clean coal. I'm talking about time travel. So consider tonight's speech a small-scale demonstration project, if you like. I want you to imagine that it's the year 2030. That climate change is ubiquitous now as Australian communities are doing the temperature and rainfall equivalent of moving hundreds of kilometres inland. Severe weather events are increasingly deadly and routine, and when Great Barrier Reef tourism operators say their offers can't last, they genuinely do mean it. We've already spent hundreds of billions of dollars as a nation through our taxes and through other bills adapting to climate change, and that's set to get a whole lot worse. However, against expectations, the world did agree to a new climate change agreement to succeed the Kyoto Protocol, but it's not the one that many had hoped for. If all goes well, greenhouse gas concentrations should stabilise at a level equivalent to 575 parts per million CO2 later this century. And that's roughly double the range seen any time in the last 650,000 years. As a result, severe impacts across the world are self-evident, and various catastrophic impacts are now a virtual coin toss. But Kevin Rudd surprised many people in Copenhagen in 2009 by agreeing at the last minute to reduce Australia's emissions by 18% on 2000 levels by 2020. And with that achieved, Australia now looks to be on track to meet its targeted 60% reductions by mid-century. Australia is doing its bit, or so it seems. But all is not what it seems in the year 2030, and some very big problems are starting to come back to bite. Globally, Barack Obama's Secretary of Energy, Stephen Chu, was right when he said back in 2009 that his country, the United States, along with other large emitters and coal producers, were hardly about to turn their backs on coal. Politically, that was too hard. Yet in spite of the billions of dollars spent developing clean coal technology, the reality never lived up to the hype. Today, in 2030, just a handful of clean coal plants, mostly in developed countries, capture and bury less than 5% of the emissions generated from coal. Barack Obama's claim that clean coal might make America energy independent is not a change that too many people believe in anymore. Almost none of the more than 1,000 conventional coal-fired power stations built in the past 2 decades in the developing world capture or store their emissions. And largely because carbon capture and storage, or CCS, hasn't delivered on time, emissions from fossil fuel burning are still rising globally. But that's been kept in check on paper, mainly because coal-dependent countries have been able to effectively hide their emissions. So rather than turning away from fossil fuels, they have offset their emissions on the international carbon market. And this trade has been dominated by cheap credits generated through what is euphemistically known as natural storage. Most credits have been generated by avoiding deforestation in developing countries. Others have come from storing carbon in forest plantations and also in charcoal. Now, while protecting rainforests and enriching soils with charcoal has been a worthwhile endeavour, enmeshing these activities with emissions trading has proven highly counterproductive. Unfortunately, these biocarbon options were used as a substitute for emission cuts, buying polluters another couple of decades. Had they instead been used in addition to cutting greenhouse pollution, there would have been much more scope to return the climate to a safe state. But that opportunity has been largely squandered. And as one of the most coal-addicted nations in the world, Australia, perhaps predictably, took the easy way out, meeting our international obligations by writing cheques to outsource our emission cuts as we crossed our fingers waiting for clean coal to arrive. Most people assumed that the Copenhagen Protocol required Australia to cut its greenhouse pollution, not realising that the emission cuts Australia agreed to make didn't have to be made in Australia. As a result, in 2030, our actual greenhouse pollution in Australia what comes out of our smokestacks and our tailpipes is about what it was back in the year 2000, around 550 million tonnes a year, which is right in line with what Treasury projected back in 2008. So we're on track with our official targets, but our biggest polluting industries are just as dependent on conventional coal burning as they were in 2010, and renewable energy remains a sideshow by comparison. To make matters worse, the emissions associated with our coal exports have doubled now to 1.2 billion tonnes of CO2 a year. And this makes us the largest carbon mule, if you like, in the world, bigger than Saudi Arabia, whose oil production has peaked and started falling many years ago, as many warned that it might. So between Australia's actual pollution and its coal export emissions, our overall carbon footprint is now 50% bigger than it was way back in 2010. And that begs the question, how in 2030, after 2 decades, can we be on track to meet our official targets, yet we're a bigger contributor to climate change than ever? What happened to that economic transformation, that low pollution future, and all those green jobs that we were promised? Well, looking back, we couldn't shed our Quarry Vision, the rose-coloured glasses through which we viewed the importance of the resources sector to Australia, particularly the coal industry. Too many of us uncritically accepted the idea that the resources sector was our economic backbone. And we weren't alone, of course. TV news directors routinely assumed that Australians couldn't sleep at night unless they knew the closing price of BHP Billiton and Rio Tinto, Woodside Petroleum, every single day of the year. Successive Prime Ministers referred to Australia as an energy superpower, even through years where we were paying more to import energy than we were actually making from selling energy. Some political leaders assured us that the resources sector actually accounted for over 1/3 of Australia's GDP, Brendan Nelson in fact. So we imagined, naturally, that millions of our fellow Australians were employed in the mines. We had the impression that government coffers were only ever awash with cash, thanks to the quarry, and we assumed that our stock markets and our own comfortable retirements depended on the ongoing success of Australia's digging and its drilling. In hard times, we thank the resources sector for saving us from the fate that befell so many other countries, especially during the Great Recession of 2008 to 2015. As boom turned to extended bust, we imagined that the supercycle was merely pausing for breath, safe in the received wisdom that the world simply couldn't do without our underground treasures, particularly our coal and particularly China. Believing that coal, our biggest quarry export, would soon be burned cleanly, we dared not imagine a future without it. And looking back, almost all of our assumptions about the quarry were wrong. It was less than 1/3 as big as Brendan Nelson said, less than 15% of GDP, even at the height of the resources boom, even if you included mining, services to mining, metal production, mineral processing and all of fossil energy. For many years, in fact, the black economy was worth roughly as much as our precious black coal exports. Too few of us realised that the quarry contributed less than 1 job in 20 in Australia, and even fewer since that time. Twice as many people worked for McDonald's as there were in coal mining in 2008. Bunnings employed 50% more people than the whole aluminium industry. And far from underwriting our retirements, some 93% of our superannuation holdings were not tied up in the quarry. Indeed, resources went from being the biggest sector on the Australian Securities Exchange back in 1992 to the smallest in 2006, near the peak of the boom. Yet even as its real importance diminished, in our minds it remained our great strength. We wrongly assumed also that the quarry was mostly Australian-owned, not realising that Australian-sounding companies like Cement Australia, for instance, were owned by the Brits, the Swiss and the Mexicans. Even the big Australian was now foreign-owned, as were all the other coal mining giants, Rio Tinto, Xstrata, Anglo and Peabody. Across the resources sector, the profits mostly went offshore. And we were too focused on digging deeper to notice that the resources sector paid much less in the way of taxes than we imagined as well. At the time, perhaps $4 in every 100, federally that is. The quarry was important, but it wasn't our economic backbone. In reality, we were service providers. Services generated 75% of GDP and 75% of jobs, roughly. As a former sugarcane farming client of mine once sneered at me very suspiciously, Australia is a nation of back scratchers. And we still are today. Looking back, we failed to learn from history, squandering the proceeds of the boom when history should have taught us that the windfall would always be temporary. Rather than setting money aside during the good times, we piled on permanent liabilities as a nation, blowing tens of billions of dollars on income tax cuts and superannuation tax breaks, which all needed funding or reversing later when the boom inevitably ended. And where we did spend money on lasting infrastructure, a great deal of it was spent on digging deeper, particularly in coal mining, as if the bust would never come, as if coal was something we could export indefinitely in ever larger quantities. And that was in stark contrast to a country like Norway, which is the world's third largest oil exporter, was also exposed to climate change, not to mention peak oil. Norway knew that the wells would eventually run dry, and to their credit, they set aside a portion of the oil revenues consistently so that by 2008 they'd amassed a future fund even bigger than their GDP. But while Norway prepared for the future, Australia was busy protecting the past. And that makes more sense when you realise that a generation of Australian policymakers consciously and fatefully decided to turn coal into Australia's national competitive advantage. As recently as the 1970s, Australia's energy supply wasn't particularly emissions intensive, nor were we a very big coal exporter, many will be surprised to hear. However, that decade saw the oil shocks and increasing global demand for coal. It's well known that Australia cut tariffs, relaxed foreign investment restrictions, established an independent reserve bank and floated the currency, all in a bid to turn Australia's economy outwards, to become more trade-oriented and internationally competitive. What's less well appreciated, however, is that we also at the same time deliberately increased energy consumption by using our cheap coal to make Australia the international destination of choice for footloose capital in energy-intensive industries like aluminium. So what our manufacturers lost without protection, Australia hoped to gain from increased exports and energy-intensive investment from abroad. Government knew full well that this would increase greenhouse emissions. After all, the addition of just one new aluminium smelter powered with coal-fired power is the emissions equivalent of adding 1 million cars to Australia's roads. But they went ahead anyway, fencing off energy policy from rising concerns about climate change. Whole chapters relating to climate change were actually cut out of official energy policy documents before publication by the Commonwealth Government because, as one long-time carbon lobbyist confided to me, senior public servants perceived it as their patriotic duty to prevent the coal industry from being undermined by an untoward focus on something that, in their thinking, was a load of cobblers. So we chose to become the developed world's greenhouse ghetto, and we've been defending that decision and working around it ever since that time. And that coal-fired mindset explains why Australia fell for the idea that energy-intensive industries were scouring the globe looking to avoid a carbon price, that as more countries made polluters pay through emissions trading and carbon taxes, that multinationals would actually move their operations to developing nations to burn coal with impunity for decades to come. As if aluminium smelters and steel mills could just be tossed into a backpack and whipped off to Indonesia or China. Unless we carved these industries out of our emissions trading scheme, we were assured that Aussie jobs would needlessly leak offshore and the environment would inevitably be worse off because developing countries have lower environmental standards than ours. In fact, something quite different was happening. The same companies were actually flocking to places like Iceland to take advantage of plentiful and cheap energy that was also renewable, not something Australia chose to offer, even though its renewable energy resources rivalled any country in the world. In Iceland, companies such as Alcoa took advantage of abundant hydroelectric power and expanded their operations with equally abundant geothermal resources. All of the major aluminium companies operating in Australia who led us to believe that cheap coal and no carbon cost was the key to their ongoing competitiveness, relied mainly on renewable electricity elsewhere: Alcoa, Rio Tinto, Rusal and Hydro Aluminium, to name a few. Using renewable energy to avoid carbon liabilities was a whole lot easier than relying on political promises when it comes to a long-term investment. So countries like Canada and Russia made the most of their competitive edge in producing aluminium cleanly, along with other energy-intensive commodities. Brazil and later the Congo both attracted BHP Billiton to smelt aluminium using hydropower. Alcoa did the same in Greenland, of all places. And they also turned to renewable energy in China, where they bought a stake in a hydro-powered smelter. Rusal, meanwhile, turned to renewable energy in China as well, taking power from a chain of hydro plants on the Yellow River. The Chinese government went ahead with large hydro projects to power smelting in Tibet, and a similar shift was seen in various energy-intensive commodities. Of course, heavy use of hydropower to produce aluminium was not without its own very significant environmental problems, but when it came to greenhouse pollution, the same companies moving away from fossil fuels abroad screamed for cheap coal and carbon subsidies in Australia or else. They wore green shorts when playing away and black shorts at home. In hindsight, when the prospect of carbon pricing became real in Australia in 2008, we were completely spooked by a few industries that were emissions intensive and or trade exposed, the EITEs as they were known at the time, EYETIs or Yetis as I prefer to call them, for their legendary capacity to use scary mythology to frighten policymakers and the general public. Our Yetis threatened to plunge Australia into a new dark age by shutting down coal-fired power stations in 4 states, shedding up to 1 million jobs, shrinking entire industries and fleeing Australia just to avoid a carbon price. Perhaps the most abominable Yeti of the time, Woodside Petroleum, even threatened to float one of its projects off to East Timorese waters just to avoid paying for its pollution. The head of the Minerals Council at the time said that even a 5% cut in Australia's emissions would mean moving, to use his words, to a candles economy, riding horses and shutting down your transport sector and your power generation. If only more of us had noticed the evidence at the time debunking all of the Yeti mythology. Modelling by the Treasury confirmed in late 2008 that there was almost no evidence to support claims that carbon and jobs would leak offshore en masse if Australia made polluters pay for their emissions. Instead, the economy would nearly treble by 2050 even if we made the 60% emission cuts promised by the government of the time. And almost every industry, including those in the resources sector, almost without exception, would grow strongly rather than shrink compared with today. Treasury also found that giving free permits to industries like aluminium didn't alter their long-term output in Australia. And other research confirmed that making deep cuts sooner created hundreds of thousands more jobs than it cost. But somehow it all went over our heads. We were gullible and afraid of the Yetis. After 11 years of denial and delay under John Howard, Ross Garnaut's early comments suggested that perhaps he might stand up to Australia's almighty carbon lobby. However, hopes were dashed in the fine print of Garnaut's reports. He fell for the carbon leakage spin. He suggested vaguely that somewhere less than 30% of the money raised through emissions trading should be enough to preserve the international competitiveness of our emission-intensive, trade-exposed industries. In other words, consumers should hand over tens of billions of dollars to our worst polluters. And that carbon subsidy should last until Australia's competitors in each of these industries faced a similar carbon cost, which could take forever if trade negotiations were any guide. And finally, he proposed a limit on the extent to which Australia might outsource its emission cuts to other countries. He didn't put a number on it, but he suggested it should be a limit so lax that it's never really tested. Garnaut made clear that if other countries wanted to live within their emission allocations, that was up to them. But there was nothing wrong with Australia paying other countries to make its emission cuts to offset our polluting lifestyle. If Australia wanted lots of carbon living space, or Lebensraum, if you like, so be it. Garneau had recognised Indonesian and PNG rainforests as the perfect place to hide Australia's greenhouse pollution on the cheap and to avoid emission cuts here. Annual emissions from deforestation and degradation in these countries alone were 3 times Australia's total emissions. So paying landholders not to log could effectively offset pollution in Australia, and various price estimates that Garneau referred to from the World Bank and the Stern report suggested the price might be as low as US $1 to $3, perhaps less than a tenth of the price of CO2 expected otherwise. And that's backed up by a report released by Greenpeace International yesterday, that some of you may have heard of. We are talking about emission entitlements, not actual emissions, said Garneau. Paying other countries to cut emissions for us, to use his words, would benefit both sides. The financial flows would benefit Indonesia and PNG, while Australia would benefit from access to low-cost abatement options. As Garneau's work concluded, certainly for me, a worrying sense of déjà vu dawned. Reduced deforestation in Australia had enabled John Howard since 1990 to claim that for years that Australia was on track to meet its Kyoto Protocol targets. Meanwhile, actual greenhouse pollution in Australia had risen by over 1/3. And what Garneau was doing was effectively offering Australia a similar way out of any future commitment, only on a much grander scale. Australia could achieve any target it took home from Copenhagen in 2009 without making any cuts in actual pollution in Australia, if it so chose. Kevin Rudd, meanwhile, had been elected on a promise of making deep cuts in Australia's emissions and coming up with what he called a blueprint for reducing carbon pollution at home. Instead, we got the Carbon Pollution Reduction Scheme, a document more in keeping with the Yes Minister tradition of always disposing of the difficult bit in the title, for it does much less harm there than on the statute books. The CPRS did not in fact reduce carbon pollution in Australia as was promised. In line with Treasury's 2008 projections, actual emissions were higher in 2020, and by 2050 actual pollution would be back where it was in 1990. Treasury assumed that only half of Australia's obligations might be met by buying emission permits and credits from offshore, but Kevin Rudd set no limit whatsoever. And this rendered much of the debate over the size of Australia's 2020 emissions target somewhat redundant. After all, if all of our emission cuts could be outsourced cheaply, then all that the government promised, the economic transformation, the low pollution future and all those green jobs, would also be fully outsourced, whether we adopted a 5% target or a 40% target for 2020. Having allowed Australia to outsource all its emission cuts, Kevin Rudd then nationalised the cost with a spectacular money-go-round of compensation payments to small business and householders and dozens of adjusted welfare payments. The ostensible aim was to offset the impact of emissions trading on energy costs, which was estimated at $312 per household per year. But the real aim was that amidst the flurry of checks, people wouldn't be able to properly identify the winners and the losers from the scheme. No one gets a free ride, said the government, and their glossy PR material went so far as to say, under the scheme, Australia's biggest polluters will pay for the pollution they generate. But what the government carefully didn't say was that the biggest emitters would only pay for, on average, 1 in every 5 tonnes of their greenhouse pollution. The rest of us would pay for the other 4. Of course, had men in suits representing these industries knocked on our front doors and asked us to write them a cheque for $500 a household every year until 2020 and beyond, I suspect we would have told them where to go. Had power companies build each household $455 to prop up the value of their coal-fired power stations once a carbon price was introduced, I doubt many of us would have paid it. Had coal companies come to our front door and asked each of us to fork out $93 per household to cushion them, of all people, from a carbon price, they'd have been laughed at, no doubt. So they knocked on Kevin Rudd's door instead, where they got a very different and much better reception. Unbeknownst to most households, Kevin Rudd agreed to write all these cheques and more on our behalf. And in doing so, by continuing the siege defence of our coal-fired economic strategy, he made it mathematically impossible for Australia to achieve deep cuts in its own greenhouse pollution. And this left Australia no option but to outsource much of its emission reduction obligation, to rely on a new carbon colonialism, if you like. Perhaps our greatest folly, though, was falling for the PR campaign around clean coal. We were constantly assured that it was just around the corner, and hardly a week would go by without some grip and grin moment involving a minister and some new funding commitment or clean coal milestone. Little did we know that the biggest coal mining union, the Mining and Energy Division of the CFMEU, was also the biggest external donor to the ALP federally for many years. Government agencies whose staff appeared in clean coal PR didn't exactly publicise the fact that they rely on coal industry funding to do their work. And we wanted to know that the sky blue colour used consistently by the coal industry in its clean coal PR was chosen because people subliminally associate that colour with clean technology. It wasn't immediately obvious that the federal government was spending far more to double coal exports than it was on cleaning up coal use, and the coal industry didn't exactly mention that for every $10 it made per tonne of coal, it was spending just 1 cent on its much promoted Clean Coal Fund. Few people knew either that Kevin Rudd's Energy and Resources Minister had told a gathering of climate skeptics at Parliament House prior to the 2007 election that Labor wouldn't touch the coal industry until clean coal arrived. Nor did most of us realise that the amount of CO2 being stored underground by 2012 in all of Australia's coal-related CCS projects was roughly equivalent to taking all the cars off the road in Tamworth. Few of us appreciated just how modest the international interest in clean coal actually was, that 48 of the 61 projects cited by the industry as progress were located in just 3 countries, Australia, the US and Canada, and that none of these projects were listed in Russia, in India or South America. Most of us had no idea that the CCS project in China, always showcased by our political leaders whenever they visited Beijing, was one of just a few in the entire country, or that it was part funded by the Australian government. None of the media coverage of that particular demonstration project mentioned that it would be the emissions equivalent of taking all the cars off the road in Nimbin. The illusion of progress achieved its main objective, which wasn't to clean up coal use at all, but to keep coal exports out of the greenhouse policy discussion. Somehow we ignored all the warnings that CCS wouldn't deliver in time. Treasury's modelling suggesting that it wouldn't even happen in Australia until 2033 under both of the scenarios put forward by the Rudd government, the 5% and 15% cuts. International forecasts that told us that CCS wouldn't even begin to be rolled out in developing countries until at least 2025. We ignored warnings of electricity generators whose early excitement about CCS had been replaced by serious doubts about its commercial and technical viability long before 2010. And we ignored the scientific community, especially people like James Hansen of the NASA's Goddard Institute, who warned us in 2008 that it was simply untenable to keep burning the coal like this even for another decade. Instead, we dug deeper, knowing that the emissions tied up with our coal exports didn't show up in Australia's official emission figures because they're counted where the coal is ultimately burned. And so long as we could outsource the rest of our emission reduction obligations, there was no need to transform our economy at all. Now in 2030, that's coming back to bite. Our economy is still one of the dirtiest in the world, the cost of outsourcing our carbon liabilities is growing, and the emissions now generated from our coal exports are so big they are too conspicuous to ignore any longer. We've postponed the day of reckoning as other countries have decarbonised, and we've missed those opportunities. If only we could return to 2009 and make some better choices. Along with a strong emissions reduction target, if our children's generation were granted 3 wishes, what might they have our governments have done differently? Well, first, they might have placed a tight limit on outsourcing so that the vast majority of emission cuts made by Australia were actually made in Australia. They'd have stipulated that polluters could meet, say, 10% maximum of their emission obligations through permits and credits generated from abroad. And that would have plugged the biggest hole in Australia's response. Allowing some carbon credits from offshore is not such a bad thing, insofar as it makes the global effort more cost-effective and transfers funds and technologies so that developing countries can industrialise more cleanly than we have. But it should never have been allowed to take the place of emission reduction at home. Had Australia set a tight limit on outsourcing, we might have been part of the transition to renewable energy rather than merely a donor to it. Secondly, government should have simplified and greatly abbreviated the compensation for YETIs, our EITEs, those emission-intensive trade-exposed industries. Some of them did face a genuine adjustment, but it was overblown and it was one that they saw coming for almost 2 decades. Yet instead the government proposed a complex set of arrangements that cost much more overall with each passing year. And in practice that entrenched a new system of corporate welfare from which it became impossible to extricate the taxpayer. It also provoked our trade competitors into adopting similar carbon subsidies, something that will take decades to unravel. And that could have been avoided if the government had set an overall percentage of emissions trading revenue aside to help such industries in the early years and then phase that assistance out entirely, say by 2015. That would have addressed the transitional difficulties without defeating the whole purpose of emissions trading, and it would have left us a whole lot of money that we could have spent on everything from energy efficiency at home and rainforest protection abroad. Of course, had we phased down the transitional assistance that fast, lobbyists and accountants and lawyers wouldn't have had such a lucrative time arguing for years now that it's not quite time to phase out our particular carbon subsidy because our particular competitor in Mozambique or Mongolia doesn't quite yet have the same carbon price as ours. But then again, that wouldn't have been such a big loss now, would it? Finally, Australia should have announced a timetable to phase out its coal industry. As recently as 1939, the United States had contingency plans for war with Great Britain. Yes, Great Britain. Yet Australia chose not to have a contingency plan for something far more conceivable, the dismantling of its coal industry. Writing an exit strategy from coal was something so unthinkable we wouldn't even dare put pen to paper. Instead, we doubled our coal exports, believing that clean coal just had to work because coal was too big to fail. We abandoned the precautionary principle on the biggest contributing factor to the biggest environmental threat of our time. And instead of recognising coal as a sunset industry by environmental necessity, we became unwitting conscripts in a coal war that could never have been won in time. Rather than becoming the Saudi Arabia of carbon exports by 2030, we should have prepared for a sunset on coal that fought catastrophic climate change rather than fuelling it. Australian governments should have announced a moratorium on new coal mines and prevented the construction of any new coal-fired power stations where the emissions were not captured and stored safely. We should have established a clear timetable for the phasing down of coal exports and coal burning at home so that by 2020 no Australian coal was being used uncleanly. Of course, it would have been dismissed as hair-shirted, as green religion, as futile and as needlessly impoverishing Australia. And I have no doubt that Kevin Rudd would have dubbed it as yet another radical plan to shut the coal industry down by next Thursday. But it would have been none of these things. Far from impoverishing Australia, the economy would hardly have missed a beat. Most of the quarry would have continued to flourish and states like Western Australia would hardly have even noticed. In fact, without coal exports, Australia's economy would have doubled in size in 2031 instead of 2030. Of course, it's true that the removal of 1/3 of the world's traded coal would not have magically undone the world's coal addiction. Only 1/6 of the world's coal was traded back in 2010. So countries with large reserves would have been relatively unaffected in the shorter term. But that doesn't mean that action by Australia would have been futile, because no country would have been impervious to the odium that an Australian coal phase down generated. And more importantly, over time, the price of coal would have risen, and the coal trade would have become much less reliable. Countries would have rightly started asking, who's next after Australia? As would the investors in the coal multinationals. If government had taken these 3 steps in 2030, we'd of course still be grappling with climate change. But we'd have a greenhouse policy of which Australians can be proud rather than ashamed. the vast majority of our emission cuts would be Australian-made, not merely Australian-paid. Our emissions trading scheme would have started working much, much sooner, and the taxpayer would have stopped paying out carbon subsidies to polluters long ago. Nor would we have fuelled a carbon subsidy war internationally. And by announcing a timetable for an Australian sunset on coal, we would have finally dealt with Australia's greatest contribution to climate change, its black coal exports. And whether or not this began what Robert Mann has termed a benign domino effect, we would have done our very best to give the world its best chance of returning the climate to a safe state. Of course, there are lots of other useful steps we could have taken along the way, but with the benefit of hindsight, these three decisions were probably the biggest missed opportunities. Had we seized them, by 2030, our kids would be thanking us for a much cleaner legacy, a bigger set of choices, and for not allowing coal exports to turn their country into the single biggest pusher of global carbon addiction. Hopefully they will find a way one day to make time travel possible, just as they'll hopefully clean up coal use. Until then, hopefully, most of the coal will remain harmlessly underground. With climate change, we only get one chance, and we don't have the benefit of hindsight, just the opportunity of foresight. We may not love the idea of a coal-burnt economy, but our Quarry Vision makes it very hard for many Australians to imagine a different future. And that's why I've spent the time I have on Quarry Vision. Because if enough of us are able to leave our Quarry Vision behind, we have just a chance to forge a different future to the one now taking shape on our watch. Thanks very much.
Okay, Guy has kindly offered to stay for some time and answer some questions, so I'm sure there are some questions out there. Yes, sorry.
Guy, why did Norway get sucked into a Quarry Vision? You said that they followed a different course from Australia. What's different about Norway?
Oh, probably the main thing is that they know their oil's going to run out, whereas we don't yet have that realisation about coal. We actually have hundreds of years' worth of coal supplies in Australia, so I think the pennies are a bit slower to drop on that front. You know, if we were to realise that out of environmental necessity, the coal industry did have a sort of a use-by date, I think that process would happen a lot faster in Australia.
So they weren't wiser than us, they just had a different commodity, so...
Probably a mix of both.
Question up here in the green shirt.
With the legislation still coming before the Senate and without there being bipartisan support for the current proposal, what do you think are the prospects for what you propose today to be included as part of the legislation?
You might want to repeat the question because people can't hear.
Given what's been proposed and what's before the Parliament, what prospect do I think that my prescription will be picked up and run with? Zero, probably. Although, just to comment more broadly on the situation before Parliament, I mean, it's hard to predict how that will pan out. You know, until recently I would have said that there was so much pressure on the coalition from what I call the Green Shoe Brigade. The sort of the banks, the accountants, the law firms, the offsetters and everyone else who can benefit from having an emissions trading scheme, whether or not it actually leads to any significant reductions in emissions, let alone in Australia. So I think there would have been a lot of pressure on the coalition to pass the scheme for all of its flaws. However, recently a lot of the utterings we've heard from the coalition suggest that they may actually block it. I don't think it's likely that there's going to be enough concessions from the government for the Greens to support it, so I think it really is up in the air. But in a sense, you know, my view is that you can't pass it because it is so flawed that once it gets in, it'll be impossible to pull back. You know, once you hand out welfare, it's impossible to take it back, and this is a brand of corporate welfare that once they get their hands on 4 out of 5 permits for free, they won't be giving it back in a hurry. So I actually believe that it has to be blocked. It can't be fixed. I mean, if the Prime Minister was to take up my suggestion on outsourcing and put a very tight limit on that, then unfortunately the maths don't stack up because he needs that outsourcing in order to be able to hand out all the free permits. So I think ultimately, if it does go down and it brings us back to the drawing board, that's a good thing.
Okay, yes.
Why do these lobbyists have such power over the government? Because if you look at this year, it's been an absolutely picture-perfect year of climate change and what it will do. Like at the moment, we have absolutely catastrophic flooding in northern New South Wales. We've had catastrophic flooding in Queensland and these terrible fires and unprecedented over 40 degree, runs of over 40 degree days in southern Australia. So why is the government listening? I don't understand why they listen to these people.
Well, I think part of the story is the Quarry Vision, which is why I'm so keen to highlight it, is that because we believe that the resources sector is so indispensable, it becomes untouchable politically. So I think a big part of the challenge is breaking down those misconceptions about the significance of those sectors that are seen as sacred. The other part of it is really systemic, which was the main focus of High and Dry, where I, through my work at this institution, had access to lobbyists really bragging about how the system worked, and through the revolving door between the bureaucracy and industry associations, how they were able to get inside and still write ministerial briefings and cabinet submissions that they used to write when they were working as bureaucrats, because most of the people now running those relevant branches used to be their underlings. So these are relationships where they're still the senior partner. So that's really worked to their advantage. But it's much deeper than that. They work out, and they have done very consistently, who are the voices that our leaders listen to, the few voices. I mean, after all, in the Australian system, you only need to really persuade a minister, a prime minister and a couple of others. It's very different to the US. And then they stitch those voices up, by helping to fund ABARES work, by helping to fund particular work by the CSIRO, by using the right consultants that came from the same political background and so on. And a good example I've been using at the moment, I think, is if you look at the Prime Minister. I mean, many people thought Howard's gone, the carbon lobby won't have so much clout. But look at the Prime Minister and his political background, and you see, strong links with the AWU, which is led by a guy who is a declared climate sceptic, really. I mean, he says he's not, but he said let's plug volcanoes if we're serious about climate change rather than cutting emissions. And then look at the people digging up the coal in Queensland. The chair of MacArthur Coal's a former Queensland Labor treasurer. And then the coal goes out, Dalrymple Bay Terminal, and the chair of the company that has the lease to that facility is another Queensland Labor treasurer. So, the links to the industry, the coal industry in particular, but all the other emission-intensive industries as well, they're just as ubiquitous and deep.
What would you say?
Yeah. We've heard with the current design of the ETS that there is a fundamental flaw, and it might come to perhaps one of you, a fourth recommendation that the government could have had. The savings that individual householders make will make no difference to Australia's net emissions because they merely increase the capacity of the generators to offset, for example, aluminium producers. Has your mind perhaps turned to how we could address that defect within the ETS?
Well, this might surprise some people, but I actually don't agree entirely with the assertion. And it's not that it's wrong insofar as it applies to the CPRS. I think I've referred to the title already, haven't I? It is true that actions by one group, whether it's individuals or companies, voluntary action that goes above what's required, right, if we have the CPRS, that frees up permits and space for other polluters. That's true. That part of it's true. But the idea that as a result of the CPRS being implemented, individual actions will no longer matter, I'm not sure I agree with, because in fact Australia's government has always been responsible for Australia's national emissions trajectory. And so we've picked a target, say for Kyoto, and we will do the same for Copenhagen. And even now, if we have no CPRS, if one group does more, if you round up 1 million people and you take your cars off the road, that frees up space so that the government has to require less of other polluters. The thing with the CPRS is it just makes that more obvious. It makes the futility of our actions individually to change Australia's emission outcome more obvious, I'd say. But where I'm attracted to the argument is that if we were to somehow insert a mechanism which made our target dynamic, so that rather than saying we've got to go to 108% of emissions in 1990 or you know, we're going to go to 20 or 40% below by 2020, to actually have that be floating, but only downwards, so that if groups went above and beyond what was required, we would actually reduce the target, so that the country would have to do better rather than having that marginal difference simply redistributed to worse offenders.
So you take account of those domestic improvements, for
Yeah,
example.
yeah. And I think that would really, it would engender a heck of a lot of public support. You know, you would be giving people a real incentive to make a difference, which they don't have now and they wouldn't have under what's proposed.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks very much, Guy, for bringing in all this information. I'm currently helping some friends in central West Queensland to have an 8,000 hectare nature refuge, which is about to be dug up for an open cut coal mine. And I'm just wondering if you have any advice for those landholders around Australia who are currently facing, you know, those battles with the coal companies.
Yeah, I do. And it's interesting, you're about the 10th person in the last few days who's come at me with an anecdote like that from a different part of the country. There's a whole lot of holes being dug in the country, in much of our prime farming land, and there are some very worthy campaigns, but they're quite disjointed. And the main focus of those campaigns has been how it affects farmers, how it affects prime agricultural land, how it affects aquifers and groundwater and so on, which are obviously worthwhile causes to get behind. What I'd like to see, I think they're going to have a lot more impact, is if those campaigns that are happening regionally can be somehow brought together and also linked to the consequences of the trade that they're feeding. So rather than merely focusing on the local impacts, horrendous as they are, I think they need to be linked to the damage that's being done, the misery that we're actually exporting through those coal ports. You know, so few people realise that one of those big ships leaving Queensland ports at the moment might carry the emissions equivalent of 25,000 cars for a year, if you can imagine that. So for every big bite we take out of the earth here, there's a huge and harmful belch that occurs somewhere else in the world. But at the moment, we're able to disconnect those things. We don't put the two together. And I think, I don't want to accuse anyone of, you know, having a failed campaign. These are grassroots organisations that have very little resources. But somehow I think we have to bring those different operations that are occurring around the country together and link them to the overall problem a bit more definitively. Yeah.
One more on this side, and then, yeah.
What do you think would be an alternative then to the CPRS in terms of an immediate sunset clause on the coal industry? Like, what, if you're in a policy position, what would you suggest? Because I think a lot of people have actually bought the argument that the CPRS is a step in the right direction. So, what would be a clear antidote to that, or a clear difference in policy there?
Well, you'll be surprised to hear that I would probably go with the 1, 2, 3 points that I trotted out tonight. Not surprisingly. I think I'm actually a supporter of emissions trading, pretty strong supporter of the idea that that's the best way for us to approach it. Some people are now sort of reaching back and grabbing a carbon tax and suggesting that that's going to somehow avoid some of the perverse outcomes that we're seeing through the CPRS. But I mean, knowing how the carbon lobby works and how creative they would be, the same arguments would apply. So rather than getting free permits, they would just get a tax rebate or some sort of other concession that would be equivalent to exactly what they've achieved through their lobbying under the CPRS. So instead of going back to the future with a carbon tax, which also worries me because it doesn't cap emissions, and that's the whole purpose of the ETS, is that you cap emissions, you have some certainty about that, and then the market sets the right price. The danger with a carbon tax is you set the price too low and you end up with emissions blowing out and going, oh dear, we didn't have a high enough price. So rather than going back to a carbon tax, I'd prefer to get the emissions trading scheme right, which means for the government it's very hard because they back themselves into this corner where it's mathematically impossible, if they do the right thing on the outsourcing front, to then cater to all of these vested interests. But I think that's what you ultimately have to do. If that fails, which I suspect it may, then ultimately we're back to the drawing board, and I don't think carbon tax is going to be the answer, and that means we're left with good old-fashioned regulation. But that in some ways that's attractive, but it's a shame because we didn't do it in a cost-effective way, which was the attraction of an emissions trading scheme. But the sort of light at the end of the tunnel is that we will have an emissions obligation out of Copenhagen or whatever comes after it. So Australia is going to have to find some way of getting there. So just because the government's proposal is blocked in the Parliament, it doesn't mean they can get out of that obligation. They're still going to have to meet it somehow.
This side, Jack.
Your analysis of how the lobbying system works left me a bit discouraged because you just seem to say, well, that's how it is and it's not going to change easily. Do you think there's also a role, even if somewhat idealistic role, for actually changing the system of parliamentary funding, because that's the ultimate source of the the carbon lobby's power of threatening to withdraw political funding for various types of just the political system that gets people elected?
I mean, there are.
Can we have something not just a change of vision, but actually change of legislation, even if we can't leave the vision to change the legislation as well?
Yeah. I'm sorry if I sound so pessimistic. I've spent too long watching them. I mean, I think at the margins there are things we can do. We can make disclosure laws on political donations more visible and disclose the smaller donations, because a lot of the donations come, through. They're small things. So a party will have a conference. They'll have ministerial lunches, and you pay a couple of grand to get in, and you can actually sort of escape the radar by doing that, and you can write it off as a sort of get-to-know-you lunch with the minister. And people will look at that and they'll say, gee, in the grand scheme of things, a couple of grand here and there doesn't really matter. Is that really going to sway the government of the day? But I can tell you, having rounded up some of those donations, working for big resources companies, that those political candidates do care about those donations. They do sort of note it down in their little black book, and the companies making those donations, or contributions I should call them, they know that full well as well. So I think on some of the disclosure for political contributions, we could be a bit more transparent and capture some of the smaller stuff, and we've gone in exactly the wrong direction. I think the Howard government in its last year or two raised that bar so that it was sort of, I think 10 grand became the limit before you had to disclose it.
More fundamentally, couldn't you reduce the need for money in politics by, say, for example, having a cap or even ban on TV advertising, as they do in Britain? Political TV advertising. I'm trying to think radically.
Yeah. Well, I'm open to the idea. I don't want to suddenly, put forward a dramatic proposal on that front and sort of shift the agenda of what I'm trying to say. But certainly, but look, the other thing I think that's quite important is, as we see in countries like the US and elsewhere, is much more stringent restrictions on the revolving door. So we don't have bureaucrats going straight out to run an industry association, then going straight back in, working with their former colleagues, writing the same cabinet submissions and still holding the whip hand in that relationship. I think that's a real part of what's going on. I also think, now that you've got me on a roll, that we address this external funding requirement that we put on some of our advisory institutions, so that organisations like ABARE, providing the economic advice on climate change policy, which they've done for over a decade now, and sections of CSIRO don't face this constant pressure to raise money to do the work of those with the cash, which inevitably tend to be at the emission-intensive end of the spectrum.
Australia already has very high per capita production of greenhouse gases. If we continue to use, for example, brown coal to smelt aluminium, how soon will it be before we become liable to new international sanctions?
Well, I don't think it'll be that long, especially if we insist on providing carbon subsidies effectively through giving free permits to the industries that are so heavily dependent on those electricity sources. I mean, in Victoria, I think I read the other day, 2 smelters use 29% of the state's electricity. In New South Wales, Tomago, I think I read, they use 10% of the state's electricity. And I remember in my PhD research, one aluminium industry executive bragging to me, in 6 sheds, we pull down 18% of Eastern Australia's electricity, as if that was, a badge of courage. I suppose it is in a perverse way. If we are insisting on protecting industries that insist on using the dirtiest sources of energy, then it's only a matter of time before other countries take retaliatory measures, isn't it?
I'll take 2 more questions. Is there one from this side again, or one from this side? Yes.
Yes, I wonder what you think about the argument that exports of Australian black coal substitutes for brown coal in India and China, which is twice as dirty. And also the moral argument that Australia is spending a lot of money developing clean coal technology that can be exported to third world countries actually means that we're doing more than our bit.
Yeah, a couple of good points. I mean, the gas industry uses much the same argument. That's the same argument that Woodside constantly trots out. If we could be sure that Australian coal was going to be replacing coal and that other coal wouldn't end up being used as well, they might have an argument to a degree. I mean, I think if you look at what people like James Hansen are saying and just the sheer damage associated with burning that coal, whether it's brown coal, black coal, what have you, it's hard to really defend that sort of argument that our coal exports are doing good. And the same really goes for LNG. It may be true that we're displacing some coal used offshore, but in many cases those countries are making decisions to go to LNG anyway. So it's not a case that if it wasn't Australian LNG they would resort to coal, which is what the industry argues. They would just get LNG from somewhere else. And there are plenty of other countries providing it. So I don't really buy that argument. I think on the coal front though, the overwhelming case against continuing to burn coal no matter what its quality, the way we're doing right now, especially knowing that CCS isn't going to be deployed on time, is such that you can't really get away with that argument for much longer if you can now. On the other issue, that's part of the illusion that's being used to sort of coax Australians into holding out a bit longer, giving the coal industry a few years longer, in the hope that we might not just clean up coal use here, but that we might cash in on this new Aussie know-how, exporting it to the world. Now, I don't for 1 minute question the capacity of Australian technologists involved in clean coal development in Australia. I'm sure they're really at the forefront of that technology. However, the idea that China might, in a way, sort of enter into a rental agreement where they pay for our intellectual property for years and this becomes a new cash cow for Australia, I think is pretty far-fetched. If you look at the big multinationals involved in clean coal technology, like Siemens and General Electric, assuming General Electric survives, ultimately they will be the ones that buy the technology in the same way we see so many other instances of Australian know-how being bought out. And then when they actually go to sell to China, the roles will be reversed, as we've seen, I think, in nuclear technology already. The Chinese don't enter into a rental arrangement. It's more like we'll pay you, you can build the first 3, we'll pay you sort of royalties for the first 2 or 3. After that, you hand over the technology, otherwise we're going to rip it off. And I'm not accusing the Chinese government of that, but that's been the dynamic reportedly on the nuclear technology front. And there's no reason to believe why it wouldn't be the same with CCS. I mean, the Chinese government are going to have the capacity to develop their own CCS technology if they don't buy it off General Electric or Siemens or someone like that. I think with the idea that it'll be Australia's new cash cow is extremely far-fetched.
Okay, right up to the back. Last question.
I'm wondering how successful you feel you've been in getting your message across since you left, what you were doing before you started this. Where do you think you're at in terms of getting your message across?
On holiday as of tomorrow for a couple of weeks, I'm happy to say. That's where I'm at. I'm a couple of minutes away from it, I think. Will said, tap the mat when you're ready. I'm not doing that yet, no. Look, it's been very tricky. The whistleblowing experience is obviously a pretty stressful one. You get your message out to some people, others deliberately want to ignore you, and they got that. And I think they got away with that, with high and dry. They were quite smart in, if I was advising them, I would have told the same thing. Wait to see if he gets any oxygen. If he doesn't, we're off scot-free. And so they did that. But I feel good for having contributed to the Howard government's downfall, even if I'm not responsible for it. As to the current situation, I felt I had an obligation, having done the critique of the Howard government, which was my own party at the time. I felt I really had an obligation to do that to the next government as well, not to really go after them, but to to simply apply the same critical eye, which I think I've done. And so, you know, has it been up in lights? No. Did I expect it to be? No. You know, Quarterly Essay is a fairly highbrow publication. It's hardly about to get me on Sunrise. So, you know, I understand that it's a long, hard fight to get the message out, but I've been pretty heartened by the response thus far. Cheers.
Right. I think with that, we'll thank you very much. Here's a little something from me. Thank you very much.